My name is Aine McGlynn.
And I'm Lizz Bryce. Welcome to a special bonus episode of Digital Comfort Zone, a super not scary technology podcast for the people powering nonprofits in Canada. For most of our careers, we've been deep in the weeds of charities and technology, but most interested in the people who use it. I'm SVP Community and Strategic Initiatives at Canada Helps, Canada's largest online donation and fundraising platform, and a charity ourselves.
And I run a small consultancy focused on the digital needs of small charities.
Before we start, a note to our listeners that this episode contains discussions of mental health and mentions of suicide. If you or someone you know is in crisis, call or text 988. Support is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Today, we are talking about resilience and mental health with Canadian Olympian Silken Laumann. Leading a charity can be incredibly stressful. I know Anya shared about her days as a managing director, the pressure to deliver programs, keep governance and compliance efforts on track, and fundraise to make sure that her colleagues and friends really could maintain their jobs was a lot and really, really stressful. And the pressures to keep up with technology enablement is hard on so many charities. We heard from one charity that said training for updating websites and maintaining updated info on social media platforms would be useful, but the staff are stretched and tackling all this is really stressful for them. But on the flip side, charities also responded that using digital technologies better would lead to less stress on staff. So the question we want to ask today is, how can we build strategies for dealing with the stress of running an organization and trying to layer on digital enablement so that we can move through it and come back to the challenge more focused and ready to take it on?
Liz, our guest today couldn't be better positioned to answer that question. Four-time Olympian Silken Laumann is one of Canada's most inspirational leaders, a best-selling author and a youth and mental health advocate. Silken's Olympic story is legendary and inspirational. As reigning world champion, Silken fought back from a devastating rowing accident to win a bronze medal in the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona. Remember that moment like it was yesterday. In her best-selling memoir, Unsinkable, Silken shines a spotlight on all the obstacles she has encountered and overcome. Silken speaks candidly about her athletic success and triumph over physical adversity, but also the intense personal challenges of her past and the fierce determination she applies to living a bold and successful life today. Silken is the founder of Unsinkable, a nonprofit organization that supports mental health of adults and youth through storytelling, resources, programs, events, and community. Welcome.
Oh, yeah. Very happy to be here.
Very, very happy to have you.
Silken, maybe we could start with you just reminding our listeners about your story of resilience.
Well, I feel like there's been many in my lifetime. You know, I think that the one that is very public was in 1992. I was going into the Olympics as the world champion. I was the world champion in 1991. And then 10 weeks before that Olympics, I was hit by another boat in a warm-up area before a World Cup race in Essen, Germany. And my boat shattered, really driving like 200 pieces of wood into my lower right leg and shredding my muscle and ligament and tendon and shattering my bone. And I went to the trauma hospital in Germany, and the doctors there said, like, you know, you may never row again, and you certainly won't be rowing at the Olympics in 10 weeks. And I was an Olympic athlete. And I think just my mindset at that time was I was incredibly focused on going to the Olympics. I dreamed about it since I was a kid. And I just didn't want to believe that I couldn't do it. Like, it was such a devastating thought. And so I kind of held on, probably somewhat desperately, to the idea that like I could go to the Olympics. And I think also I did have an understanding of how resilient my body was, because, you know, as an Olympic athlete, you have just this amazing recovery power, and you're so healthy, your vascularization from all the breathing that you do in sport, and, you know, having your heart rate at really high levels. So I just had a sense that I could do it. And I held on to that a little bit like a life raft while I was in the hospital for 3 weeks. And then 10 weeks later, I was at the Olympic Games, not as a spectator, but in the starting gates with the fastest women in the world. And through, I don't know, some sort of divine intervention, as well as my own, like I say divine because I can't explain it. Like, I can't explain how physiologically I was able to be in an Olympic final and win an Olympic bronze medal. But, I think a combination of my own will, my body's amazing ability to recover, and, maybe everybody screaming at their television sets, I cross the finish line with a bronze medal. So that was a very magical and special event in my life. But in truth, the resiliency came way before that. And it has been a theme throughout my life. I think to excel, you have to be able to come back every time, there is an obstacle. And, that is called resiliency, our ability to kind of bounce back from our struggles. Because, life generally is not smooth. And the more risks that we take in life and the more things that we choose to kind of build and be part of, the more obstacles that obviously we're going to face.
That's an unbelievable story. It's funny, I was listening to Lynn Hill, who is a very well-known rock climber. She established one of the hardest routes in the world in the 90s, was the first climber to do it, male or female. It was a feat not repeated for 12 years. She's extraordinary. And I was listening to her speak on a podcast yesterday, and she spoke about that athletic sense of looking at something incredibly difficult and challenging, but that you just go, I think my body can do that. Like, I know my body can do that. I know it's possible. And that there's something about elite athletes that you have a confidence that your body can move you through something that seems undoable.
Yeah, I think you have a different relationship with your body, because you're working with your body every single day and asking your body to go harder and to pull harder. And you also just kinesthetically, most sports have a technical aspect to them. So you become aware of where your hand is in space and your feet are in space in a way that a lot of people aren't. So there's this tuning in to your body that, if you're not an athlete or a dancer or something, it would be really hard to have, or maybe a yogi. I also practice yoga, and, you get a very good sense. I could say that I can feel my organs in my body now after that many years of practice. So yeah, when an athlete says, I think I can do it, and they also it's not built on nothing. It's built on pretty strong intelligence about their body.
Yeah. Physical intelligence is something, we don't often sort of talk about or think about, but I think that's a really interesting way to put it. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people try and avoid stress in their lives, right? Avoid pain, avoid fear, avoid shock. Obviously, that's impossible to do. Those things are going to find us, whether or not we try and avoid them. But athletes kind of seem to do the opposite. Athletes, it seems like, tax their bodies, intentionally put themselves through stress in order to compete at a high level and to perform at a high level. And I guess, obviously, that's an asset in competition, and it can be an asset in life. But at some point, does it become a liability?
Absolutely. To live all of life looking for that adrenaline rush that sport can give you, it could be quite toxic for your health, mentally and physically. I do believe that trying to avoid stress is impossible, and that most of the stress that we create in our life is stress in our head. You put two people in the same situation, and one person is going to find that situation really stressful, and the other person may just look at it as an event in their life. And I think, at least in my life, a lot of the people that are most stressed out are actually people that are very in their head. So I do put myself in situations all the time that are stressful, I guess, raising money for my charity, creating something from nothing, speaking in front of 5,000 people, launching my podcast next week, all of those things I could perceive as stressful, but instead I kind of look at them as adventures, and I have a belief that they're going to be successful because I'm going to bring myself fully to them. And I guess I've always had that. It's not confidence, because I actually don't think of myself. It's funny because I have four kids, 2 kids and 2 stepkids. And my daughter, my youngest, said to me a couple of days ago, she's like, "Oh, Mom, you're irritatingly confident." And I was like, that is actually not true. I said, I have fought so hard in my life to be confident. And And actually in my sport life, I think I was physiologically ready to win way before. I had so much self-doubt. And I absolutely, in the last 10 years particularly, I have a lot less self-doubt. But I would say my first 30 years on this planet, I was full of self-doubt. But I also had this desire to create and to put myself out there in everything that I did. And I think that was always stronger than my fear. Just kind of getting back to this idea, like, are we addicted to stress? I think that you could go through your whole life kind of addicted to the adrenaline rush that comes from, having a really stressful goal and reaching it. I look at it more playfully now. I think I look at it more as something that I want to do and I have joy in doing. That mindset shift has come over a 20-year period.
Yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. Yeah.
Just laughing when you were talking about the people who are stuck in their head. And I was like, oh, that's me over here. I'm the person stuck in my head watching you two athletes talk about athletics.
Oh, no. I am very much stuck in my head. That's
why we get along. But I was thinking the part that, of course, I can relate to about your story as not an athlete is that the mindset thing. And I mean, reading your memoir about sort of like the doubt that comes in right before a big race. And as you're saying now, of sort of like, I don't know, needing to fake your way a bit through in the world and have people see you as confident when you maybe weren't feeling it inside. So as a speaker and in your blogs and also in your memoir, Unsinkable, you've talked about how the challenges you've had in your life have been just as much as part of your story as the successes. And so how do you see the role of setbacks in reaching those goals?
I think that the fact that I have been quite hard on myself in life is both a hindrance and an asset. I spent a lot of time beating myself up in my 20s, my 30s, and even my early 40s. And, that came from childhood. That came from living in a house where there was a lot of unpredictability. There was trauma. My mom had a personality disorder, undiagnosed, and there was really no space in our family for anybody else than my mom. And so I think that really did profoundly affect who I kind of became as a young adult and well into my 30s and 40s. At some point, I decided to take ownership of that. I made the decision to heal the cycle that has happened probably intergenerationally in our family and to look at myself with pretty clear-eyed view and to deal with the shit, quite honestly, layer by layer by layer. And I kind of emerged with more grace for myself. However, that didn't take away my drive. I think beginning that whole process of self-discovery, I was afraid that I'd come out of it less inspired, less motivated, less driven. I just think the drive changed, right? It went from having to prove my worth as a human being. I think for a long time, subconsciously, I believed that if I acquired accolades and proof that I was worth it, I'd be worth it. And then I started to understand that there was no amount of external, even being one of the most famous people in Canada for a while wasn't enough for the shit that I was saying and believing about myself. So I had to deal with what I was telling myself. And I could only deal with that by going back into the past and understanding where it first came from. That was a really hard process and it's ongoing. However, now there's a greater joy that I take in accomplishing things for the fun of it and for the purpose of it. The platform that we've created, Unsinkable, which is a story sharing platform that was created with this idea that personal stories have so much power. And building this into an organization and finding out, how we can help more people. And, even now looking at having a more formal narrative therapy program within the organization. All of those things, there's an element of fun in it for me now and joy because I see that, we're helping real people and seeing their process of discovery. Yesterday, I was talking to Tyler Smith. for the podcast that I'm actually launching next, not too long from now, called Inflection Time. And Tyler was talking, he's a survivor of the Broncos bus crash. And he wrote his story for us about 8 months after that devastating event. And now he's a speaker, and now he is talking to, all over Canada about mental health. He's a mental health advocate. He just won the amazing race with his partner, Kat, and to see his evolution as a human being brings me a lot of joy. So the motivation has changed, and it's not coming from fear and doubt anymore.
All I'm just sitting here and it's resonating so much with me for, a lot of shared themes, even though I didn't ever channel mine into athletics, but so much of the way that, we motivate ourselves when it's come from a less positive place. And it's just really great to see the shift, right? Like I understand so much that you're motivated by different things now once you've worked through some of that, but building those resilient skills, whether it was fun to do or not.
And it's funny how we divide the world, right, into athletes and non-athletes. It's really funny because so much comes from what we were exposed to as a young person. We develop this whole belief about ourselves, like whether we're athletic or not. And I come across so many, men and women, but I guess I more hear from women who really didn't see themselves as athletic because that wasn't their, they had gym. Lizz, we were talking earlier about being tall, right? And how when you're tall, you develop really quickly, and you're not going to be very coordinated when you're developing really quickly. And so at a time where, the more compact people often just are more coordinated.
I appreciate compact over short. As a short person, thank you. That was very generous.
And then you think then by the time you're 13, you've got this belief in your head that you're not good at something. And actually you can actually spend your whole life avoiding being active and the joy that sport and activity can give you because but I'm not an athlete, but I am all these other things. And on the flip side of that, as an athlete, you really can get put in a very tight box. People saw me as an athlete that overcame an accident in the 1992 Olympics, and that was inspiring and an athlete mindset, but I'm a lot of other things. I'm a reader, I'm creative, I'm a writer. I'm very driven, but I'm definitely a creative. So being flexible in how we see ourselves is incredibly important in life, because if we don't have that flexibility, then we also probably won't have the ability to explore all the different aspects of ourselves, all of which ultimately lead us to be more completely actualized. If you do not embrace any part of your physicality, you're actually missing a piece of yourself. On the other hand, if you don't embrace any part of your creativity or your intellectual, bent or whatever it is, you're missing out on that part. So I really encourage people, and I really practice looking at people as whole people, not the stereotype of what we might see. And that was really compounded yesterday when I was speaking to Madeline Tevlin, who is an actress and a model and a spokesperson, and she has Down syndrome. And that, I think, is the ultimate of somebody sees you and makes a million assumptions in a second. We all have some version of that. They see you physically, and then they make an assumption of who you are.
I think there's such a clear connection between the message that women receive about their place in relationship to sport and women and their place in relationship to technology, right? There's a lot of overlap there in terms of how women perceive themselves in relationship to those two things. So I think we're often making connections between sport and learning or sport and delving into technology, because so many women and women identified folks have received messages that, numeracy and data literacy are not for them. They haven't been invited into learning about it. The style of learning about technology is often not relational and conversational. It's very like, here's a technical manual and you follow all these steps. And, sometimes that doesn't, really integrate well with the way that we learn things, which really actually bridges really nicely with how Unsinkable works, right? You're sort of bridging a gap between traditional mental health services, which is typically unidirectional, right? And instead getting into this relational model of, well, let's speak to each other and get to breakthroughs through a sort of shared experience of being vulnerable together, of what our journey through mental health and wellness looks like. And it does remind me of one of the things that I do with my clients who are small nonprofits struggling with technology, is I ask them to describe their feelings about technology. That's how we start off a conversation or how I start off a webinar, because we usually don't talk about feelings in the context of technology, but yet everybody's got big feelings. I mean, who hasn't just like thrown their phone down in disgust because they're like, this thing doesn't work, or I can't figure it out, or whatever, right? Like flashback to half an hour ago when we were all like struggling with our mics and everything. But, my clients often in a first consult with me, or someone I'm just meeting and speaking to for the first time, will talk about their technology problems. And at the end, they'll say like, you know what, that felt like therapy. Right. And it's because they don't have a lot of safe spaces to admit what they don't know. And especially as leaders of organizations, and most of these folks are women, they feel that they're expected to have a certain level of knowledge about digital enablement and all this kind of stuff. And they don't. And that's not their fault. Right. So, I think that there's something really powerful and important about telling stories about things that stress us out. Right. And how did you come to that place of creating Unsinkable and knowing that there was power in a relational model of sharing vulnerability?
Yeah. I've been a speaker for 35 years. And really, my approach to speaking has always been to tell my story with the intention of telling everybody's story. So my story is unique to me, but I also understand that the things that I struggle with are somewhat universal. I've had these amazing opportunities to have quite an interesting story in terms of the things that I've been able to experience in life. But when it comes down, when you sort of strip away the excitement of being like an Olympic athlete, or having I could tell stories about parenting through the autism lens, or through, neurodiversity, there's still stories of parenting. So that universality and understanding that has, I think I've always had. But when I wrote my book in Unsinkable 10 years ago now, and then I went on a book tour, writing that book was kind of like standing on the precipice of a cliff, because I made myself so vulnerable in that book after not really doing a lot of that before. And I thought, I am going to change public perception of who I am with this book. When I actually went out on the book tour, what I heard from people over and over was like, oh my God, thank you. And I heard other people's stories, and they were not just stories about how they hurt their leg in 1992. They were stories of what they'd been through. And I'd always thought I wanted to have a good news newspaper. I was like, why, when we turn on any kind of media, is so much of it not empowering and soul fulfilling and, esteem building? When the stories I actually hear in real life and the people that I meet in real life actually are. Because I'm looking for that all the time. That's the lens that I choose to see the world through. So Unsinkable was really created out of a response, a need I felt to tell other people's stories, and that I had this platform. I was so lucky. I got to tell my story. I got to write a book, and how much that helped me. In fact, I think even though it was is it the hardest thing I've done in my life? It was pretty much up there, writing that book and publishing it while my family was still all alive. But it was also probably the most liberating thing. It's woohoo, it's all out there. There's not much more to tell. And that there was this feeling of taking my power back, which was so huge. All of it, taking my power back, also dropping the load of lies and shame, I think, I'd carried a lot of my life. And that's how we started, was, okay, like, let's tell a whole bunch of people's stories. And then it became more about, because a lot of the storytellers say, oh, this was great, I told my story and it was published and I got this response. And like, that was a really cool part, but they wanted to do more. And so that's like, how do we connect storytellers to storytellers? And then the pandemic hit. And mental health was really put on the front burner, where, well, I don't know, it should have been put much more on the front burner during COVID. And I think somebody intelligent should have done an analysis of unintended consequences, because I think the unintended consequences of COVID are far greater than the consequences
that we could predict. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so we then started developing programs and, ways of youth connecting to one another. And then we brought in a psychiatrist and a counselor and a psychotherapist, like, to help us like build our efficacy, like the effectiveness of our programs. And also, it's been a very organic thing. And we probably need to learn more about technology. I mean, we're at a technology-based organization, but I think we still are in the beginning stages of really understanding what technology can do for us, what artificial intelligence could help us do. I tend to look at things more from the human perspective, like, how do we connect human to human? And we need to interface that with, well, yeah, but what can technology do? Which I probably, to be fair, our executive director and other people in the organization know and understand more than I do.
That's kind of the connection we're trying to make, though, right? Or like, what can technology do? But how do we talk to the humans that have to use it?
Well, you think about, before the technology, we could never do this. We could never be having this conversation without being in in a studio. We're doing it in a room. We don't even need to be face to face. We're lucky enough today that we're all in a room together, but usually you can be in all sorts of places. And I don't think counseling, for instance, used to only happen in person. And now I think it's a more popular model even than in-person counseling is online counseling. And now they're even, using artificial intelligence to kind of filter and direct people towards the right resources. So I like to think about it as technology for good. There's a lot of negative things about technology in terms of like young people and their addiction to their screens and the way that's creating neural pathways that could really be damaging long term. But there are also really great opportunities to use technology to connect humans to humans and humans to information that is inspiring. So one of the filters that we have in our content is there has to be an aspect of it that's hopeful and helpful to others. And sometimes you think, like, I remember we published this one story, and it was a story of a woman living in a northern remote community, and one of her sons died by suicide. And unbeknownst to her, they'd actually had a suicide pact. Her two sons and her second son also died by suicide. And I remember thinking, like, how do we publish this story? Like, how can this story give hope and help? And yet when I actually read this woman's story, she had found such purpose in assisting others in her community and their children who were at risk of suicide. And she had found a lot of joy in working with other families and parents. And she had genuinely found a path to live after what I think most of us would consider really the worst, right? Like, there's bad, and then there's like unthinkable. I think that kind of comes into the unthinkable category. And so her story was very well received, and other people who had lost children, either to an accident or to death by suicide, really were encouraged and uplifted that there was a path forward. And so that's what we want to do with our stories. I mean, you might read that and like, it's completely unrelatable but for the people who it is relatable to, it's really powerful.
I love what you're explaining, which is that you can find the universal in the particular. So people's specific experiences can become, these universal lessons. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things that you're doing with Unsinkable. It inspires me to sort of tell my own stories and to think about the stories that I have that are very specific to me. But I know that there's a lesson and a value in them for other folks, which is part of what I think we're trying to do in some ways with this podcast is, like Lizz said, to speak about the human side of technology and the very real human struggles that people have about their feelings of deficiency, or they're not keeping up, or
that's really real, isn't it? I mean,
it's so real.
I even feel that sometimes in our own organization, there's so much going on, and there's this sort of pull, like, I'm a public person. So should I be on Instagram? Should I be on, Twitter? It's not even called Twitter anymore. Like and there's this feeling of, I think a lot of us really struggle with that feeling of not keeping up and missing things. And I always say, you've got to decide, how important is it to you? Like, my husband is, I would say, terrible with technology, and he runs a huge company. He runs Good Life Fitness and owns it, started it, and technology is a whole department in there, but he really doesn't even know how to turn on his computer. Like, we've got to help him sometimes with the very basic things. And I think that feeling of being so frustrated. And I always just say, like, decide why you want to do something. So if you want to be on social, why do you want to be on social? What do you just feel like you should be connecting to all these people on Facebook? Or maybe Facebook isn't actually a big thing for you. Maybe you'd rather pick up the phone, and you're generationally at a time, in a time where people actually pick up their phone. My kids are not really big on social. They don't spend a ton of time on those social platforms. So you get to decide, like, why is it important? And I think also to be empowered. Increasingly, I find myself empowered to manage my own filters, to like look and control the content that's being shown to me, so that I can continue to create a positive space in my social feed. I always say, like, my dad's 87. He just got an iPhone. He's pretty stressed about his iPhone. And I said, Dad, like, you can get people to help you. You can get people who understand it better. And like it's a whole world now, isn't it? And if we try to understand that whole world, it is going to be overwhelmed. But say, okay, I need to learn how to work my phone. You're my dad. You need to work the phone, because I'd really love to teach you how to do FaceTime. It'd be nice to see the grandkids. And so that's a manageable piece that has a purpose. Like, for me, it's got to go further than that. I need to understand a little bit more about, like, the podcasting technology, and I need to understand more about my social feeds, this kind of thing. So we get overwhelmed by it by trying to do it all.
That's a great way to think about it, is like identify the purpose of it first, right? Because I think, technology for technology's sake is not really beneficial to anybody, but technology towards a very, very specific goal. Yeah. Okay. Now we can get buy-in, and now we can sort of do the hard work of improving, our skills or what have you.
And it'd be nice if we talked a bit more about that, not only on this podcast, but just generally about where people can go to learn more skills. I was thinking the other day, I was on my iPad, and I'm like, I need somebody to teach me how to navigate my iPad a bit better, because this is like, I'm doing the same thing over and over again the wrong way. And if I just spent like an hour every couple of weeks, I think I'd really be able to save hours and hours.
This is it. This is the perfect segue to the question about progress, right?
I was just thinking also, though, about people who are overwhelmed by this work. And so we've got understanding the purpose. What are you trying to do? And then the question that we often bring up is technology the way to get there? Because sometimes it's not. And then what skills do you actually need to know for that? Because I think also this feeling of overwhelm is the feeling that I must build skills in all the areas about technology. But if we're like, you need to understand how to deal with your data so that you can better steward your donors, or you need to understand how to connect two systems because it's going to help you in this way. You can learn just those skills. You can start with just those skills. You don't have to learn all of them. So I like even just your dad's willingness and curiosity to do it, seeing some opportunity. And I mean, I went through that with my father too, of trying to get him to be open. He was not 87 when he started. He was younger, and being open to it. And then slowly over time going, oh, I can see some benefit. I like being able to be in a group chat with my children or something else.
Yeah. And don't you find that people are quite polarized? Like, when people get overwhelmed with technology, it can be like, this is hopeless. I'm not going to touch technology. Like, it's like, I'm either not going to do it, or they think technology is the answer. So like in our organization at Unsinkable, we know that technology allows people to come into group chats and to do online counseling and to be part of a community. But we also know that like the people part of that is more important. The technology is to assist with the connection, right? It's not, how do you say it? It's sort of like the thread that brings it all together, but it's not the meat is the people and the content but you can let that connection and the technology be a block and then go, well, technology is not important. Well, it is important. And what I see increasingly too is that it does get easier. Like when you start to learn, then the other thing that you have to learn is easier. Whereas if you just say, well, I can't do this, like I can't online shop, well, yeah, you can. You just have to do it a few times. And there is like replication and there is a learning curve.
Oh, Silken, get out of my head. It's just, what you're saying there about that sort of incremental progress, right? Like once you do things a couple times, you break past that discomfort of that first learning barrier, right? Because like it's tough to learn new things. Like it really is. Like we've adapted to be efficient in how our brains work, and that means that we rely on habit so that we can have all of these sort of shortcuts that help us save brain power and all of that. But those habits sometimes get in the way of creating those new neural pathways, which is very difficult, right? So it's like, well, I can't possibly do that, right? But then it's like, no, actually, if you do that a few times, you get through that initial discomfort that demands that you turn on that sort of slow thinking part of your brain that goes, okay, I actually really have to pay attention to this, which again is taxing, and especially in our quick fix, short TikTok video era, right? Like, we've kind of lost a little bit of that ability to turn on that slow thinking, slow processing part, but that's essential for learning, right? And I think people forget that actually you only have to apply that attention and that like real sense of effort a few times. And then, again, coming back to sort of the kinesthetic intelligence of athleticism, it's a similar thing, right? It's like the first time you sat in a boat, you weren't like, okay, cool, got this. It was clumsy and you maybe capsized a couple times but you showed up to continue to push past the effortful stage till you got to a place where with a destroyed ankle, you were able to win a bronze medal, right? Like that's just a perfect example of like, letting your experience and your skill and your strength move you past something that seemed impossible, right?
Yeah, it's true. And when it comes to a not-for-profit, do you find that most people in the world of charitable giving and impact are behind in technology, like compared to companies?
So, statistically in Canada, we have a skills shortage and a skills gap with digital skills across the board. Where charities struggle more is because, your husband is a perfect example. There's a massive IT support team for Good Life Fitness, right? So as a leader, he doesn't necessarily have to be fingers on keyboard knowing how to run a report or configure a database. When you're a charity of 4 people and you're running, an emergency shelter for women fleeing domestic abuse, your training is in social services, all of a sudden your board is
there's no IT department to help you out.
Exactly. So that's where the struggle really comes in, is that you have this whole sector of folks who are largely women or women identified, who again have been traditionally kept on the margins of the conversation about data literacy and numeracy, being forced into a context where donors, volunteers, stakeholders, funders all expect a certain level of digital sophistication when they interact with your programs, your services, or your presence online.
We've been really fortunate recently. We've developed a partnership with CGI. And so they're really helping look at our technology needs and helping us like sort of get outside of our own organization. And I think that's where not-for-profits can be very proactive in finding partners with a technology team. It doesn't even have to be, a company that does technology consulting. It can actually be like, okay, we'd love to have funding, but we'd also love to have some of your IT department's time because we need to outsource this.
Yeah. Well, we're running short on time, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the podcast.
Yeah, I think just before we go, you're launching your own podcast, and we'd love to just hear a little bit about it and where people can find it.
I'm so excited. We are launching Inflection Time, and I think I've my whole life wanted to do a radio show. I've always loved radio, and I was interviewed 35 years ago by CBC Peter Zosky Morningside, and I remember him asking me, like, how does it feel when you're out on the water? And me having the time to actually explain. And I think that's really where that seed was planted, where I thought, like, I'm going to do this someday. And I think it just as a speaker and having done as much media as I have. And when I recorded the first sessions in June, and the idea of Inflection Time is really to talk to interesting people and to get them to sort of think about their life, where those points were that their life could have gone one way or another, and what the opportunities were and what the decisions and risks were that they took. It's a pretty organic conversation. There's a very huge variety of guests between, Haley Wickenheiser, who I had on, and, we got deep into like hockey and, what it was like to be a woman in sport and the emergence of a sport, and Madison Tevlin, who I talked about earlier, who is this actress, has Down syndrome, and then Erica M is on our show, and she was like the Much Music queen. So it's a very eclectic group of people, and I hope that it's inspiring. I hope it makes people think about the moments in their lives and the decisions that they made, and that it in its own way is empowering for people, because you're listening to some pretty amazing people being quite vulnerable, talking about moments maybe where they wanted to give up, where they found themselves homeless, somebody that you wouldn't expect. So I'm loving it. I found that when I was recording yesterday, I was recording a few months ago, I was recording, there was a sense of joy I really felt, and kind of coming home that, oh, actually, this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing right now.
Well, we're really excited to listen, and we hope that everybody else listening today will go and join you over on your podcast, Inflection Time.
Yeah, you can find us on Apple and really all the channels that are there. I look up Inflection Time with Silken Laumann.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today, for joining us in our office. It was a true pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Liz. Thank you.
Thanks, Silken. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Digital Comfort Zone. There are some great takeaways from today's episode that should help you think about how you can keep your mindset flexible and build resilience in yourself and in your organization. We'll link to Silken's new podcast, Inflection Time, and her charity, Unsinkable, in the show notes. The best way that you can get started today is to check out Charity Growth Academy and start your assessment. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating. This helps other people discover the show. Thank you to our amazing guest, Silken Laumann, our podcast producers, Christian Robillard and Richard Villeneuve at Purpose Podcasting. This podcast has been a production of Charity Growth Academy by Canada Helps. Support for Charity Growth Academy has been generously provided by MasterCard ChangeWorks and MasterCard Impact Fund.